important for every business, and also understanding the minimum requirements to be eligible for cyber insurance. And then finally, we're also going to be looking at directors' responsibilities in relation to cybersecurity and the importance for company directors to understand their duties around protecting their businesses from cyber threats. Throughout the presentation, we're also just going to hear about some real world cases where cyber attacks have occurred in Australia and the impacts that these incidents have had on those businesses as they've occurred. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So if you do have any questions as we're going through the presentation, you'll see the Q&A button just at the top of your Teams panel. If you can just put any questions that you may have into the Q&A, and we will come to answer as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. So we should hopefully have about 15 minutes or so to get through questions after the presentation has finished. So without further ado, I'd like to just introduce you to our panel of experts for the webinar today. So first of up, we have Lorraine Cave, who is an account manager at McLady McShane. We have Dudley Neller, who is a partner at Gadens, and Scott Mathrick, who is the technical director here at Kane Mathrick Tech. So I might start with you, Lorraine, if you could perhaps just tell us a bit about yourself and also McLady McShane.
Thanks. A bit about myself. I've been a broker for 20 years, working on various lines of insurance and of late, in particular, cyber insurance. I do have a number of different clients in different industries that have, varied programs, but most of them now, do focus heavily on their cyber insurance, and so they should. The market at the moment is growing for it. McLady McShane, we've been a company for the last 12 or so years, where it's John McLady and Mike McShane merging together their broking houses together to create what we have today. We have hundreds of employees throughout the country through our authorised representative network, as well as our joint venture network, and obviously our Richmond head office, where I am an employee of. But we've got a large amount of experienced brokers, not just for cyber, for a whole range of other insurances as well. But it's a little bit about us, and I'll hand back.
That's great. Thank you, Lorraine, for the introduction. And over to you, Dudley, if you could introduce yourself as well and a bit about Gadens.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Short and sweet. Gadens is a large commercial law firm based in Australia with offices in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and we in the Melbourne and Sydney offices in particular specialise in technology, cyber and privacy. So I sit in the intellectual property and tech group. We've got about 25 or 30 lawyers and paralegals that sit in that team. I work particularly in that cyber and privacy space, as well as the tech area. Lots going on at the moment, obviously. Can't read the front page of the paper without seeing some new cyber attack that's occurred. So we're really timely to be having this session today to talk about all things cybersecurity, and looking forward to it. Thanks.
Right, thanks, Dudley. And finally, to our technical director here at KMT, Scott Mathrick. Scott, if you could just introduce yourself, and I know that you'll be then launching into your presentation from there.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So again, Scott Mathrick. I'm the technical director at KMT, and I head up the professional services team, which is our project side of the business, but also our cyber security side of the business. So we've had a cyber platform in now that we put together about 5 years ago, and that keeps evolving. So I play a big part in that space of the business as well, which probably leads us into the part of the conversation where we're going to be talking about some of the facts today and what we're seeing. Next slide, please. And we're going to go through some of the facts that are based on all the reports that you can all download from the ACSC. So if no one understands or knows what that is, it's the Australian Cyber Security Centre. They post out a report. It comes out every 6 months, and we've gone through some of those facts today to actually explain to you all what the facts are and what we're seeing, but also how they're changing as well. So looking at the site at the moment, In the last report, so the report used to be quarterly, it's now monthly. Oh, sorry, it's now 6 monthly. So the last one came out last year, so from July to December last year. And these are the latest stats. So there was 497 notifications in the last report. So that was up from 26% on the 6 month prior. But if we break down what was in that report, there was 350 criminal attacks. There was 123 human errors, and then there was 24 system faults. So that's what made up the 497 notifications. And 70% of all breaches were caused by some form of criminal attack, and we'll speak more about that later. 91% of breaches involve information such as contact information, home addresses, phone numbers, email, tax file numbers. So all the information that shouldn't be exposed. If we're thinking about the latest one, we probably all would have heard about Medibank last year. That was our second largest attack we've ever had in history here so far, Optus being the biggest one, but those two attacks happened last year. And 71% of businesses now are identifying those breaches within the first 30 days, which is, if we compare that to about 24 months ago, it was 3 or 4 months. So in Australia now, we are getting a lot better at actually identifying when those attacks are actually coming in. If we go to the next slide, please, Charlie. And what we saw from last year, so some of the key facts here. So the number one incident now that affects any business is now a cyber incident that was reported by Allianz. And if you think about that, COVID has changed the way we all work. We have, or most of us now are using some form of SharePoint. We have all our integrated supply chain solutions, as well as other SaaS-based platforms. So the way that we're working now is much different to what it was prior to COVID. The average cost reported by the ACSC last year for a breach was just over $276,000. And that takes into account the actual money that someone's paid for ransomware, the forensic cost to actually restore and get an external party in to actually understand what's happened, but also the legal fees that actually come with that as well. So it's quite a rise from what we've seen last year. Everything does keep increasing. And 19% of businesses here now have cyber insurance of small to medium businesses. If we compare that to the States, they're at about 47%. So we are still behind, but we are getting better, because last year it was under 10%. Next slide, thanks, Charlie. And then if we go down to the actual breakdown of what's happening. So again, this is from the latest report, but the key thing from this slide here is the two bar charts that say compromised or stolen credentials or phishing, which make up 50% of the actual attacks that we're seeing. So 50% are either phishing or stolen creds. And what that means is, when someone does steal those credentials, they then have that information to get into your systems to implant ransomware, which we probably all know now is one of the biggest factors, and what's causing the most havoc is when we actually have that ransomware attack. And you can see that up the top of the chart is now at 29%. So again, just those numbers that I spoke about before, 350 out of that, I think it was 497 attacks now are now criminal. So it is advancing. We have brute force attack in there. That's always in there. So a brute force attack is something where you do have a phishing attack or your credentials have been stolen, and someone is using those credentials to try and brute force your systems and try and get into those platforms. We took on a new customer last year, brand new, they come to KMT. We put some tools on there to understand what was happening. They were having about 47,000 hits per day just on one server internally that actually wasn't locked down properly. They had some phishing attacks. Some people had got those credentials. Thank goodness they were the wrong credentials, but they were using those phishing or those credentials to keep trying to penetrate that system. Next, please, Charlie. And if we look at industries under most attack, this doesn't change. The top two are always there. We've got health service providers, and we've also got finance. So if we think about that, what's coming within those, or the information that those industries hold, especially medical, we're talking about blood types, allergies, medical conditions, obviously phone numbers, there could be Centrelink numbers, and the same as a financial field as well. They would have tax numbers. There's a lot of information in there that, if exposed, can actually lead to some kind of third-party penetration. So, but what's interesting about this report compared to the 6 monthly report that was behind it is that the health services in the previous report had 39 breaches. On this one, they're at 71. And the finance recorded 24 breaches in their last report. At this one, we're up at 68. So everything is changing. Next, thanks, Charlie. And then just again, this is an extract from the report as well, but just to actually confirm what's happening, you'll see there that the health industry, again, that's at 8%, but again, because of the information that they're holding, we've got the education and training is always up there as well, plus government. And again, it's because of all that sensitive information. Next, thanks, Charlie. And then going through the cybercrime, so the average losses. So this is what we're seeing. So small businesses, the average loss, and this is purely, it doesn't factor all the costs in, it's the actual financial loss based on the breach. But if there is other financial costs such as forensics or legal fees, the fees are actually much higher. But if we're talking about a ransomware attack, these are the average sums. So a small business is at about just under 40,000. What's interesting here though is a medium business is actually higher than the large business. And that's because the medium business doesn't have the platforms in place or the budget to put in that full cyber platform that a lot of those large companies can. So that's why we're at about 88,500 here. We're seeing that across our clients as well. We do hear of this all the time where a client's had a partner or a friend or someone that owns a business and they've had some kind of attack, and we're seeing these numbers all the time. Keep going. Thanks, Charlie. So business email compromise or BEC, this is one of the biggest things that we've seen. We've probably all heard of a friend or a partner that's had some kind of business email compromise, and that's when an attacker has a phishing attack. They get into your system, they have a password, they get in there, and they sit there and they monitor your email, and they work out what you're doing. And then, especially if it's an accounts person, an invoice will come through, they'll doctor up the BSB and the account number, they'll send it out on behalf of you, and then that end person goes and pays that invoice and the money's gone and you're expecting it to come in and the bill hasn't been paid. And these are the breakdowns from each state. WA leads the way. I'm not sure why. I wouldn't have thought that, but it's common. But Queensland as well at 112,000, but Victoria down at $56,000 is the average loss, the average business email compromise. One of our customers had a partner. This was about 3 years ago. They bought a house. They had to pay the deposit. The surveyor had orchestrated the deposit invoice. They sent it to the person. The surveyor was on Google Mail. They sent it. The end user paid it, and then the surveyor hadn't seen it, so he contacted them and said, "We're still waiting for this money to come through." The person said, "I paid it last week." They hadn't seen it. That's when they realised that the surveyor within their Google Drive had an email compromise. Someone had got in, they changed the BSB account numbers, and the person transferred about $250,000 and never got it back. So we're seeing this a lot. And again, it comes down to having that education within the business. So when you're paying a bill, sometimes it's that old mentality where we pick up the phone and we actually ring the person and we just clarify that the BSB and the account numbers are actually correct before we're actually making that payment. I just built a house last year. I had to make 6 payments, and for every single payment, I picked up the phone when I got the invoice and I rang their accounts department and said, "I'm just checking, can you please clarify, is this right?" Which it was. But just having that process built into your business, and when you're paying those bills, you're actually going through that process. Next, please, Charlie. So this article came out late last year, and it was basically that Australia is the most hacked country in the world at that point in time. So if we look at the report and the articles down there, and once we finish this presentation as well, you'll be given all the links to what we've spoken about, but the link is within this article. But essentially, from October, there was a massive change last year. So we had about 107,000 breaches last year. Actually at the start of last year, but in October last year, it was reported we had 1.7 million breaches in Australia last year. So it's up 1,550% on the last numbers. And we're seeing that a lot. And what that equates to is that there's 22 accounts breached every minute, which was up again from the last quarter. So to prevent this from happening, and I know Dudley is going to speak more about this later, but there have been new legislations that have passed now. So people are getting fined. There was a legislation passed now that the most sum that any business could be breached as a director of a business and saying that it's trying to explain that when you're a director of your business, you're responsible for your data. The most that it could have been was 2.2 million, but last year it got passed, so a new legislation came in. So now any business that has an attack or haven't secured their data properly can be fined up to $50 million or 30% of their adjusted turnover for that period. So the landscape's changing now, and we're seeing more and more of this coming through, and I'm sure Dudley will speak more about that later. Next, we'll just go on to speaking about some of the cyber attacks, and I've got an example. Just go to the next slide for me, please, Charlie. This is one that happened to me last week. I actually, not on purpose, but I knew this webinar was coming up, so I was on Marketplace, and I was trying to sell something on Marketplace, and this is a typical form of a phishing attack that happens on that platform all the time. So I was trying to sell something. It was an inverter I had on there was $250, and this gentleman's come and spoken to me. He said, "Hi, I'm interested. When can I come in, or where can I pick it up from?" I gave him my home suburb. I live in Listerfield. He's asked me the conditions. So just a stock standard question. I said, it's brand new, it's great. And then he asked me for the address. So I gave him the address of where the pickup was. But then the next message, he asked me that he's going to go send someone to pick it up, which for me was, it just didn't feel right straight away, because that's what most of the attackers will do on here. And he wanted to use my Pay ID. Whenever you're selling anything, Pay ID is safe. But this is a dead giveaway when someone's trying to buy something from you on Marketplace. So I gave him my phone number, and next he shoots through this nice little graphic, which I'm not sure where he got from, saying that it states that he's got a business account and that he can't take anything lower than $1,000 basically. So what he's asked me to do is send him my email. At this point, I knew that it was just a phishing attack, so I gave him a fake email. And then he's going to send me this email, and I'll show you that in a second. And then sorry, just go back for me one step. Sorry, Charlie. Beautiful, thank you. So then he's gone through, he's telling me that basically because of the limitations on his account, he's going to transfer me more than the product, but I have to transfer him back $499. And I said, okay, sure, that's fine. Just tell me what I need to do. So I kept playing. And then he wrote, can you promise me that once you receive the payment, you would refund back the money? And I've gone, yes, of course, that's fine. All right, sounds good. So he's going to process the payment now. And I said, okay, thanks. And then he's asked me if my email is correct because I gave him a fake email. I said, yeah, I've got it. I'm reading it now. And then he's asked me, can I see a screenshot? Because he knows that I've given him a fake email, but I've told him that I still received it. And then he's asked me to see a screenshot, and I've gone, how do I do that? So the attacker was actually willing to see my screen and actually help me. And then he wants to see a photo, and then I played dumb and I said, I don't think it's safe that I send you a photo of my computer. And then he wrote just to instruct you what to do. And then I just wrote a bit of a tongue-in-cheek message that I wrote, have you worked out that I'm playing this stupid game you are? I've just reported you. So he left that conversation straight away. But if you go to the next slide, Charlie, this is the email that actually came through, right? So you can see it's from PayPal Help Team. It's a PayPal help team at AOL.com. So it's a completely wrong address, and it's all the wrong information. It's got all the padlocks on there. It looks right, but it's actually wrong. So that's what we're seeing around. So that's a good example of a phishing attack and what the attacker and the links they'll actually go to try and get that information from you. Next one, please, Charlie. And then obviously ransomware. I think we've all heard of ransomware now. Again, it's up the top of the breaches within the government reporting, but assume you'll be hit. The government are advising us not to pay the ransomware, and sometimes that's not possible, especially if you don't have backups. But you need to have backups and make sure that your systems are in check. So in the event you are hit, we can simply restore the backups. Layered protection. So we also need to understand where our data is and what the crown jewels are. It's very hard for some companies to put in a full cyber platform because of the cost. But if we have one system that generates most of the company's revenue, it would make sense to protect that first before anything else. And the government do advise us not to pay the ransom. But again, sometimes that's not possible. You need to have your backups and check in place, and also have some kind of recovery plan as well. One of the biggest things, like when something does happen, what's the actual plan to recover the entire system? And sometimes it's just as simple as having an A4 sheet of paper, and it's got phone numbers of all the people that you need to speak to, and everything's there for someone to actually start that process. And I'll finish up just with the next slide, Charlie, just the effect, I suppose, on COVID and what it's done to us. So we're all working from home now, so we're no longer within the castle walls, so to speak. We don't have a dedicated firewall or protection within our networks. We're all working from different places now. So it's important that we're no longer trying to protect the office network, but we're trying to protect the endpoint. And the endpoint could be an iPad, a mobile phone, it could be a laptop, and working from home. So we're working from all different locations now. We're in shared offices, we're working from cafes. So we now need to get smarter and actually protect the endpoints. So I think basically most of the most of the issues that we have seen from last year, and especially all the phishing things that were coming through, have been based on fake job offers, on vaccine results. And that's had a 59% increase on the actual breaches that were reported to the ACSC last year. So it keeps going up and up. It's going to continue going that way. But that's the data that we're seeing at the moment. And with that, I'll hand over to Lorraine.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Charlie. Just dive straight into it. I guess a common question I do get asked is obviously who needs cyber insurance. The short answer to that is pretty much if you've got a cyber present, if you have a computer, if you have a mobile phone, really, you do need cyber insurance. So as per the slide, obviously, if you have a website, if you've got any personal identifiable information, you store or take or have any interaction with any credit card information, sensitive customer data, especially health information, as was touched on earlier. If you are reliant in any way on your computer systems to operate as a business, and if you use the POS software, obviously, which isn't one that does get thought of very often, but it is vulnerable nonetheless. So next slide, please. So what does cyber insurance cover? So it can be broken into, as per the slide, the two main areas: first party losses and third party losses. So first party losses is basically what directly affects yourselves, and that covers for things like financial loss you may suffer as a result of a cyber attack, so downtime, loss of reputation, cyber extortion, so the actual costs of the cyber attack, hiring negotiation experts, which most insurers do provide that as part of their cyber policy, so it's not necessarily getting anyone external. Covering off the demands and hopefully the prevention of future theft. And then obviously electronic data replacement. So if you can't recover what was lost and backups aren't there, the cost of helping recover or even replacing business data and records. Third party losses, so that's more so where it's going to affect the operators that you work with. So you're going to have, obviously, with the privacy laws that have come in, so security and privacy liability, data breaches, the damages associated with that, loss of third-party data held in your system, defense costs. So if you do have to defend yourself, in court or against third parties, that is a large part of this policy that does get called upon. Again, you've got your regulatory breach. So if you are, in breach of the privacy laws that are in place at the moment, obviously that is ever changing as well. And obviously that small electronic media liability, copyright infringement, defamation claims, whereas that is mostly available. There are some industries that is not necessarily available to, but that can obviously be discussed on a one-on-one basis on there. But generally it does cover that as well. Just next slide. So touching on what is not covered, cyber insurance is a great insurance policy to have, but like all insurance policies, it's not a 100% foolproof measure of making sure that you are covered for every eventuality. if you sustain damage to your computer hardware, that's not covered under this policy. However, there are other material damage policies in place that can, investigate covering for that. So, it is recommendable that when you are looking at cyber insurance, that you are looking at your insurance program in totality to make sure that, you are covering off, everything that you can from all angles. It doesn't cover criminal actions committed by you or your business. And that is pretty stock standard with any insurance policy where there is a purposeful criminal action performed. There is a process involved when that does happen. And, obviously, again, something that can be discussed a bit further. Cyber attack based on facts which you're aware. So basically, if you know that something is going to happen, you've been given an indication and you have not taken any action, or you have, purposely, misled, and it has led to a cyber attack, then there is a possibility that you will not have a successful cyber insurance claim. So it is important that whenever you are, made aware of something or suspect something or anything like that, to report it. And even if it eventuates to nothing, it's better to report it than to not, because worst case scenario, it can be seen as a prejudice to a claim. So criminals using the internet to steal money from you. And the reason why that isn't necessarily covered under this policy is because there are other policies that are in place to cover things, for monetary losses and fidelity losses and whatnot. So it isn't the intention of the cyber insurance policy to cover that. And even in regards, then there are certain factors that have to be taken into account before that can even be covered. And obviously, there are other exclusions. And as I said a little bit earlier, it's best to have your insurance broker review your whole program as a whole in totality to cover off not just your cyber, but, where other insurance policies can, sort of overlap or work in composite with that as well. Let's go to the next slide. Thanks. So we'll just touch on a case study. And this is a pretty, it's a pretty common scenario what happens. So you get, you or one of your employees sent an email, looks very much like the email that was sent to Scott. It looks pretty innocuous. You may or may not investigate it more or not, but it's basically, giving some demands saying that you won't be able to open up your systems, or if you don't respond in a particular time or pay the ransom, that you will not be able to access. Rather than paying the hacker and opening your business up to further extortion attempts, you hire an external IT consultant to recover your backup data and the files and upgrade your antivirus software. So that is one way that you can do. Another way is that you could pay the ransom, but we can touch on that in the question time. But just say you don't do that. While the fixes are going along, you have to close your business, causing you to lose some revenue, affects your reputation, and one of your clients threatens to sue you for the delay, and which obviously costs them a large amount of money. Cyber protection policy allows you to recover some of these costs. And obviously, depending on your policy, you may be able to make a claim for some of these costs under interruption to your business if that particular section of the policy has been selected. And that is something that you can discuss with your insurance broker to the suitability. It also does rely heavily on what your incident recovery plan is as well, to whether, which sections of the policy are taken and which are not. But ultimately, what you want is the cost of recovering your data and upgrading your software and ongoing crisis management expenses covered. So that's in this sort of situation where it is, fairly, common for that to happen. A cyber insurance policy can be quite helpful in that case. Just on the next slide, I think that's the last one for me. Nope. there is one more. Sorry about that. So minimum requirements. Now, if you can see in that sort of pinkish box, that is now the absolute minimum that insurers require companies to have in place to qualify for cyber insurance. In the past, you could probably get away with maybe half of those. But as it stands today, multi-factor authentication is an absolute must. If you have employees working off-site, porting in or anything like that, it just has to be there. Proactive patch management is another one as well. If you're not keeping up to date with, installing patches or or having an IT department do that, then unfortunately, you are basically leaving yourself open to pretty much anything that comes along. But without these in place, it does make it, I won't even say that it makes it extremely hard to get cyber insurance. It makes it virtually impossible to get cyber insurance. So if you are at any point looking to upgrade, I guess, your security requirements, this is a list that you should probably be having as your minimum there. Yep, and to the next one.
All right, it looks like it's my turn. Thanks, Lorraine. First of all, I just want to stop and talk very briefly about what Scott mentioned to start with before we have a quick look at this RI advice case, and then there's another case too that we'll look at. And I hope you've had your coffees for the morning. I'm not going to try and put you to sleep with too much legal jargon. Scott mentioned the changes in the Privacy Act that came through in December. So as he mentioned, December 13 marked a day where we saw an increase in privacy fines moving from 2.2 million up to really a maximum of 50 million. And we're now in a situation too, with the release of the Attorney General's report into the Privacy Act in February, of a whole host of changes that are coming through, and I'll outline them if we've got time towards the end of today's session. What I did want to do in the sections that I'm talking about is have a quick look at this case, perhaps as a first start. RI advice, or the RI advice case, is a really good example of obligations that directors are needing to take on board in terms of cyber insurance. So in this situation, back in, I think the case came out in May 22, but related to a whole host of problems that this financial services firm had stretching back to 2014. So over the period 2014 through to May 2020, the RI advice business and its supporting practices had 9 cybersecurity incidents. So ranging from just out and out hacking through ransomware, phishing, email attacks, and then between December 17 and April 18, an unauthorised agent gained access to one of the authorised representatives' servers and sat there causing mischief for about a year and a half. And obviously, we're talking about cybersecurity issues that are not just sort of one-off events causing loss to clients, but really the court looked at the pattern of behaviour and conduct by this particular business. As a financial services provider, it is required to have what's called an AFSL, or Australian Financial Services Licence. And really that's what the court looked at in terms of the importance of that business having responsibilities to its customers and certainly not being able to discharge them adequately. So the court found in May 22 that the directors of the RI Advice Group had breached their various directors' obligations because they hadn't insured adequate cybersecurity measures were in place, both within the business themselves, but also across their authorised representative groups, and that they'd also breached the Corporations Act by failing to implement adequate cybersecurity and cybersecurity resilience measures. Again, the court took the view that by not doing that, they were exposing their clients to unacceptable levels of risk, and that was borne out by all the various examples of those cybersecurity events that occurred during that period. In terms of what that actually meant by way of penalty, and I think that, to be honest, they got off fairly easily, but they were required to pay $750,000 costs, and they were also required to properly engage a cybersecurity expert to go about undertaking an investigation of the business and really looking to implement cybersecurity measures and controls across the business to deal with those risks more effectively. If I can go to the next slide, Charlie, I'll just look at this next case as well. Very helpfully, Lorraine's talked a little bit about what is covered and what's not covered within cyber insurance policy. So it's probably worth saying that the headline here, which says, court finds insurer not liable for ransomware cleanup costs, it would have sent shivers down the spines of many of you who do have cyber insurance policies. But it's probably important to state that the policy that this business had in place wasn't a specific cyber insurance policy. So they had another policy which they claimed under. And as Lorraine mentioned, it's really important to understand what you're covered for and what you're not covered for, because your policy may not respond in the way that you're expecting it to. This case really involved a claim by the business in relation to a ransomware attack that occurred. The InShape business is an automotive distributor and services firm, and the outcome for them, which was obviously very disappointing for them at the time, was that they just couldn't make the claim in relation to cleanup and recovery costs, and all of the usual sorts of costs that Scott mentioned would be incurred by a business with a cyber incident to deal with. So the costs of forensics, the cost of incident response, and importantly, the cost of the replacement hardware. Those costs, obviously subject to the particular policies that you have in place, but those costs are more likely to be covered under a standard cyber insurance policy. So the takeaway here for businesses who are wanting to understand and perhaps take on a cyber insurance policy or get cover for cyber incidents is make sure that you're getting the right policy to begin with. Understand that a cyber insurance policy will deal better with a cyber security incident than trying to sort of make it fit into your existing portfolio where it might not sit well. And this is a classic example of a business that's cut a corner, hoped and crossed fingers that it was going to be able to recover costs from the ransomware attack under its existing portfolio of insurance, and then finding out that the policies are, they're pretty specific. This one in particular from Chubb, who's pretty active in the cyber insurance market, was very specific. The policy wasn't a cyber security policy, and so the recovery was pretty limited. If I can go to the next slide, thanks, Charlie. So what does that mean in terms of additional obligations or perhaps new obligations to take on board? The RI advice case in particular makes it very clear that as directors of your organisation, there are three things that are really important to take on board. First of all, the case makes it pretty clear that you need to have a general understanding of cybersecurity risks as it affects your business. It doesn't expect you to be an expert. It doesn't expect you to have a technology background, but it does expect you to have a broad understanding of cybersecurity risks as it might affect your company. secondly, with that understanding and that knowledge, the courts are keen to ensure that you go that next step further. So when you understand the risks that affect your organisation, the next step, the natural next step, is that you engage appropriate cybersecurity experts, whether that's directly as employees or as consultants, working closely with an MSP, you know, a KMT or similar organisation, to come in and assess your organisation's risks, and then to set out a program of works to implement reasonable controls to manage those risks. Risks are never going to be reduced to zero. It's pretty clear that cybersecurity's incidents are here to stay, and that it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. But understanding what you can reasonably put in place to reduce that risk is really important. Having people that really know what they're doing helping you do that is critical. And finally, and again, Scott mentioned this earlier as well, having an incident response plan in place to manage the damage that will be caused where there is a cyber attack on your business. So those are the three takeaways for directors, particularly coming out of those cases, and the RI case in particular. In terms of the slide itself, I think the bullet points speak for themselves. There has been a little bit of guidance from ASIC. You can see back in 2015, there was a report that they put out around cyber resilience. We are seeing changes proposed under the privacy reforms that are likely to come towards the back end of this year that will also increase risk to directors and officers, as well as increasing the penalties for failure to manage breach events appropriately, and we'll talk a little bit about that too in terms of the increased notification obligations that are going to form part of those raft of reforms. If I can have the next slide, please, Charlie. So in terms of takeaways today, yeah, it's up in big red bold type. If there's anything that you do take away from today, it's really taking on an understanding that you do have a potential personal liability risk under the Corps Act as a director if you're not taking cybersecurity seriously and implementing measures to prevent risks occurring to your company. There's some, I guess, to-dos under that slide 1 through 5. So keeping informed in 1, backing that up with policies and procedures, and actually ensuring that that's flowed through and makes its way across the organisation, and that people, your employees and your contractors are aware of the policies and procedures in place. Adequately resourcing cybersecurity is critical, and that's perhaps the biggest challenge that we see with small business and medium-sized businesses. That the reality is it's an expensive exercise. Don't expect to become resilient overnight, but do have a program of works and allocate appropriate budget to do that over time, which we've identified in 3. I won't pretend to cut across Scott's space in the technical area in 4, but he's obviously spoken about the security controls that are important from a technology perspective. And then finally, understanding that at some point you will be hit, and understanding, well, what can I do so I can recover and respond as quickly as possible after an incident occurs is critical, and having that incident response plan that properly triggers and allows you to move from a reactive response to a more proactive response is really important. That's probably enough legalese for me, I think. Charlie, can I have the next slide, please? And I think that's it. I'll hand back to you, Charlie.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dudley, and to Lorraine and Scott as well for what was a very informative presentation, and covered some really important ground in all those areas. We've got about 10 minutes left now to do a bit of Q&A. So we have had a couple of questions come through so far from the audience, which is great. So we might just spend the next 10 minutes sort of going through a few of those questions. There's one here from Jason. Now, Jason has asked about how much does a typical insurance policy cover? I've recently been given quotes for $2 million maximum, and is that enough? Lorraine, I might hand over to you for this question. I've just got you on mute. Sorry, Lorraine.
Sorry, they ran a fire drill while this was happening, so I didn't think you guys wanted to hear that. So in regards to limits specifically, it is dependent on what your industry is and what you do. So like for instance, for a managed service provider, 2 million would not be enough. In regards to a general for instance, like a real estate agent or anything like that, 2 million would be sufficient. So it really depends on, Jason, what you do and the advice that's sort of given to you from your broking professional there. But if you are getting quotes on 2 million and that's the maximum that you've been told that you are able to get, that may have something to do with the industry that you are in. But 2 million isn't a bad amount. The limits do go all the way down to 500,000, which 500,000 I wouldn't recommend for anyone. Minimum would be probably about $1 million. So if you are getting quotes for 2 million, that's it sounds like you're in the mid range, and depending on your industry, that sounds like it would be a good limit to be at least starting at.
Right, thanks, Lorraine. We'll go to another question from Fergus. Fergus has asked regarding minimum requirements for insurance, and that their business has seen some policy that requires across-the-board password changes every 45 days. What he's found is that they've encountered a lot of conflicting advice that this practice can actually lead to repetitive, weaker passwords. Scott, I might just hand over to you on this one, just around password policies and what best practice is now.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. We review a lot of cyber policies for our clients as well, and they're always different answers, whether it's Chubb or someone else, but different questions. Regarding password policies, it depends on the infrastructure that you have in place. So if we're looking at the Microsoft best practice, the best practice now is not to change your password. But there's a caveat there, because you need to have the right infrastructure in place to make sure that everything is safe. And by that, there's new ways that Microsoft have introduced now, where you download a database to your servers that prevent users from using the same password, or simple known bad passwords is what it's called. But to have that in place, it's not out of the box. So a lot of stuff has to go in to actually get that safely, or to get that platform in a safe way to actually have that. The other way is, most of our clients, it's 30 to 90 days, depending on what suits the company. We always advise 30. We change our passwords every 30 days. We all use password managers as well. So it's always dependent on the company, but we do need to be changing passwords. I did an audit for a customer last year. They were a new customer that we engaged. They're a traffic control group or sort of company. And the director there hadn't changed his password since 2000, and his password was 4 characters long. So if something like that happens and there's a dark web breach, that password's then used to go and infiltrate that company. It's really important that we at least doing some dark web scanning or some other things in the background there to work out if there is a breach, to go and change those passwords. But more importantly, they should be rotating all the time. And again, it's building that culture within the business so that when we're asking the users to change their password every 30 days, they don't get frustrated, but they actually understand the reason behind it and why we're asking them to change their passwords. And it is probably different from policy to policy as well. I know with a lot of the MFA that we're seeing on cyber policies, some policies will ask if the user has MFA on Office 365 only, and then other policies will ask if they have MFA on Office 365 and VPN. So all policies do differ as well.
Right, thanks, Scott. Dudley, I might go to a question to you just around privacy laws and cybersecurity laws, just around whether, or covering off any changes that may be coming up in those areas that could potentially impact business. If you wanted to talk to that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. So as I mentioned in my brief comments a few minutes ago, there's a lot happening from a cybersecurity perspective, and also importantly from a privacy perspective. From I guess the headline changes that are likely to come through are a reduction in the notifiable breaches obligation from effectively 30 days at the moment to 72 hours, which is really short time frame for organisations to have to report on a breach. That marries up with what we're seeing in the EU and the UK, which has been 72 hours for a while, and there are some regulated industries here in Australia through APRA and also Security of Critical Infrastructure Act requirements that also have a 72-hour notification obligation. Importantly for the people on our call today, the other two big changes in the Privacy Act are likely to be the removal of the small business exemption. So a lot of you who may be sitting under that 3 mil revenues per year haven't had to comply with the Privacy Act up until now. There's going to be a consultation period that goes with this, but it's likely to see the small business exemption removed and requiring small business to comply with the Privacy Act once the legislation comes through. The other big change is the potential removal of the employee records exemption too. So lots of organisations that have had breach events occur have very much focused their attention on customers and other stakeholders and managing those risks, and have put the poor old employees to one side and taken the view that they're not required to notify them because they're not because they have an exemption under the Privacy Act. That will probably no longer be the case as well with these changes. So businesses will need to allow for an account for their employees when incidents do occur. That's sort of probably it. There are lots of other changes flagged, but potentially around making the payment of ransom requests illegal. That's not come into being yet, but we're expecting that to continue to bob up and be a conversation piece. Obviously with Medibank, Optus, Latitude Financial as well, the government is very active in this space too, and we're looking to see more regulation coming in directly around cybersecurity resilience for companies, and making it an obligation on directors too to have that cybersecurity awareness in terms of how they're running their business. So but I'll probably leave it there if I can, Chris.
Thanks, Dudley. We've probably just got time for a couple more questions just before we hit 1 o'clock. So there's another question that's come through from Damien just around cyber insurance excesses and whether they're payable up front or are they payable upon settlement of a claim. So Lorraine, I might go to you on this one.
Yep. So unlike, I guess, like, property excesses and those sort of things, usually, and this isn't the, the letter of the law, but usually it does get taken into account in the settlement. But there are some times where certain services are called upon within an insurance claim, whether it be with a negotiator or anything like that, where the excess or partial excess may be payable upfront. It really just depends on what the terms and conditions are of that particular policy that you do take up. So one of the things that it is one of the responsibilities of an insurance broker is to explain when you accept a policy how the excess is payable, and you should be told that upfront, and then what circumstances it could be taken into account into the settlement, and what circumstances it does need to be paid upfront. So I guess to give you the short answer, it really is policy specific and also event specific.
Thanks, Lorraine. And we'll go to one final question from Sean. Sean's asking whether KM Tech is providing cyber liability cover as part of an IT managed service to ensure a client's infrastructure remains compliant with the policy. Scott, I'll go to you on this one if I could.
Yeah, sure. So when we have clients that come to us and they actually need to be Essential 8 certified, and some clients need that, whether they're government or NFP, we put a platform in place that we can give them a compliance report. So each month they get a full report from us. It has the the requirements in there, and then it maps all their computers against it. That platform then goes out if something goes wrong or if there's a check that fails, it creates a ticket within our system, so we can guarantee that the compliance is always there for them. And then in the event they had a cyber breach of some sort, that's the first thing that the cyber insurance would want to know, is if they've been doing the best that they could to be compliant with their policy and with that monthly reporting that comes through. That would advise that they have been doing that, providing that's kept up to date. And again, we send that out every month.
Right, thanks, Scott. Thanks again to all the panelists for answering all of the questions that have come in from the audience. That's greatly appreciated. So just in wrapping up, if you are interested in learning more about what your business can be doing to bolster its cybersecurity posture, there will be an email sent out following the webinar, and you can actually request through that email to be contacted for a further discussion. Alternatively, you can go to our website, kmtech.com.au, and there's a contact us form on the homepage, and we'll be able to follow up on any inquiries that you may have from there. Just for Lorraine, is there any additional information you'd like to provide the audience if they're looking for additional information about taking up a cyber insurance policy?
Well, I could obviously direct you. I highly recommend to visit the McClarty McShane website, which we can provide details in regards to that, and that does give a little bit of information about cyber insurance in general. I'm also happy to provide that information directly. So if Scott, you were happy for my details to be passed along to anyone who would like to have a bit more of an in-depth discussion, happy to do that. I guess with all insurance policies, not just cyber, it is best just to have that one-on-one conversation, so it is tailored towards your business and your needs, rather than just looking at the general sort of information. General information is good. It can give you a really basic overview, but at the end of the day, you're going to need some advice that is tailored specifically for your business, your industry, and your specific needs. So I'd recommend just getting in touch and having a discussion with myself.
Thanks, Lorraine. And finally to Dudley, just for the audience, about whether if they may be looking for additional information on some of the content that you've spoken about, what would be the best way to reach out to Gaydens?
Give me a buzz or shoot me an email or touch base on LinkedIn. Happy to answer any questions, and I'll be off the clock, so there's no bills coming through for any questions arising out of this presentation. Just happy to help.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dudley. Thanks again to everyone who's been able to join us today. I hope you've found this to be a really informative presentation and discussion, and for giving up an hour of your time on a Thursday afternoon. And as we've said, we've got the ways that we can